What's going on, guys? It's another episode of Atlanta Basketball with Caleb Johnson. I am your host, Caleb Johnson. Go ahead, give me a follow on social media at ATL Johnson 18, as well as the radio station where I work and where you can find a lot of information about the Atlanta Hawks. Sports Radio 929 The Game. So at 929 The Game is where you can find them on social media. We've got a lot to get into in this episode, and unfortunately, a lot of it is rather negative, if I'm being completely honest, just because of where the team is at right now with a major injury. I definitely want to talk about who Quin Snyder sees as a primary ball handler on this team, and maybe who he pushes back on being that sole guy. Also, getting into the most recent game for the Hawks as they took on the Orlando Magic and what happened late in the fourth quarter that maybe was weird or maybe was absolutely nothing. And those of us in the media and some fans overread an entire situation. But the first thing that I want to get into is just what life is like without Trae Young. Unfortunately, it's something that the Hawks, as they planned for what this season was going to look like, never thought they would find themselves in the position of having to play significant games without Trae Young. I mean, make no mistake, the Atlanta Hawks were built around Trae Young and what he does well. And so when he's available, they're able to pull out all the tricks and things that they want to employ on both ends of the floor. And when he's not there, I think they have been to some extent left scrambling, trying to figure out who is that person that steps up. Because of course, we've all heard it in sports, right? Next man up mentality, all of those sorts of things. But it's different when it actually plays out in front of you and you realize, oh, other guys have to actually fill these voids that the Hawks have right now, the void that Trae Young leaves. And in fact, it was interesting talking with some fellow media members uh, when the Hawks were taking on the Magic. I was watching guys who I was thinking, oh, he's doing that like Trae would. Oh, he's doing that like Trae would. And it was kind of interesting to see how guys, whether it was spin moves, whether it was passing, whether it was how they were attacking the paint and putting up floaters, like all of these sorts of things. You saw the effects of that's Trae Young's had on the Atlanta Hawks, and you think of it mostly when he's actually out on the floor and dishing those assists and putting up those threes and all of the different ways that Trae Young attacks the game. It's just when he's not there, you start to see that from other guys. And so, just kind of like right off the bat, I mean, unless you've been under a rock and have no idea what's been going on with the Hawks lately, Trae Young is out for at least the next 4 weeks. We're kind of reaching the point where we're in like the 3 week range where he's going to get reevaluated. But Trae Young in that Brooklyn game last Wednesday had Mo Gay fall into him. It was completely on accident, but Trae's knee obviously bends back incorrectly, the way it's not intended to, and it is now confirmed to be an MCL sprain on Trae Young's right knee. And so they're going to reevaluate Trae in 4 weeks or somewhere about in the 3.5 week range at this point. But that doesn't mean that when they reevaluate him, he'll just be back and available. We're looking closer to the 6 week range that we'll have with Trae Young being out for this Hawks team, which means a lot of guys are going to have to step up because as much as it is a cliche, yes, there is a next man up mentality. You literally have to fill the void. It's just how effectively you're able to go about doing so. One thing that I have heard from other media members covering the Atlanta Hawks that I know I just have to put out in the ether, and in case you are listening to me and aren't aware, it is very easy for people to fall victim to the thought that, well, if the 6 foot guy is no longer out there on defense, that means that the Atlanta Hawks defense is just automatically better. And that's not just point blank necessarily the case. Also, turnovers don't just improve because Trae Young is off the floor. Because I know a lot of people think of, this idea that, well, Trae has a lot of turnovers, and he does. But if you were to look at the league and who turns the ball over the most frequently, it is top guys in the NBA. These are guys who have the ball in their hand a lot, have a high usage rate like Trae Young does, and Quin Snyder actually spoke about the usage rate that Trae Young has had this season, and how impactful that's been, and how ever since the summer the Hawks have been planning of how they would play with Trae Young. And so the fact that they are without him means, yes, guys are having to step up, but it's the way that guys are having to step up that is going to be kind of interesting, because when you have a high usage rate guy, that means you have someone who is used to having the ball in their hands, and that's going to have to be passed down to someone else. That means guys who maybe weren't playing at all or were playing very few minutes are now expected to play more minutes. And what have we seen, in years past when it was a guy like Jalen Johnson who was missing? Is you were really impressed by the guys who stepped up, but we all kind of collectively told ourselves, man, what would this thing have looked like if Jalen had been available? If Clint had been available, if you weren't playing your third, fourth center, if you weren't you thrusting Zaccharie Risacher into the starting lineup as a rookie, all of these sorts of things. These are questions that we've had in the past that have had to be answered about this team, and now the most recent one is how this team plays without Trae Young. People are going to overreact to wins and losses. And in fact, I find it interesting that whenever the Hawks so far have won, because the Hawks are 2-1 without Trae Young, that people naturally overreact and say, well, the Hawks are better without Trae Young. And I simply know that to be incorrect. The stats say otherwise. Just because you're winning games does not mean you are necessarily a better team, even if you're able to pull off wins. The wins that they've had against the Pacers and the Magic, yeah, they've been great wins, and there's no doubt about that. Have there been some flaws amongst them? Sure. Getting off to slow starts, having a lot of turnovers have certainly been a factor for the Hawks through these 3 games without Trae Young. But I think there's another element of this too that fans oftentimes overlook, which is if the Hawks were just terrible without Trae, you would be calling for Quin Snyder's job. You would be calling for Ansi Solei's job. And the fact that they did their job well, Ansi specifically, in having other ball handlers, something that we'll talk about in a second that Quin Snyder spoke about, and the fact that they have guys who can score and guys who can, get stops on defense, like all of these things, because they have to a measure depth on this team that they haven't had in years past. I think it's weird to criticize that and say, well, the Hawks just don't need Trae Young then. They're better off without him, or whatever, might be the hyperbolic speak about Trae not being a part of this team. And I think just people have to be very careful of realizing, yeah, just because this team from a roster perspective has been improved and they haven't been absolutely terrible out of the gate without Trae, does not mean that the hole that Trae leaves on this roster is not going to rear its head and be a problem at times. And I think Cleveland was a perfect example of that when you have major turnover problems against the Cleveland Cavaliers in what was a close game at times, but ultimately rather lopsided by the time everything was over. I want to get to some audio, and I'll play some audio throughout the show from Quin Snyder, and this came from his November 4th pregame and also postgame as well around that Orlando Magic game. The first one that I wanted to get to was just Quin talking about, I asked Quin essentially how important, how vital can practice be, because you're trying to figure things out essentially on the fly not having Trae there. So how valuable can you use practice to be? And it was interesting because in true kind of Quinn fashion, he started off by saying, well, we're actually using the games as more helpful analysis than we are practice, but then kind of circled back around to talking about the fact that, practice is a great opportunity and shoot around is a great opportunity for them to maybe have more strenuous, physical play with one another as they sort of try to figure things out of filling the void without Trae. But I found it interesting essentially how Quinn is viewing this and what he needs guys to do now that Trae Young is not a part of this team for at least the next month.
For them to develop a comfort level, but for their interaction with other players. Trae, losing Trae is different than just losing a player because of his usage, his position, and a lot of really since the summer, a lot of what you're doing from a coaching standpoint, trying to figure out ways to make your team function. A lot of that centers around him. So
yeah, so the Hawks are putting guys in new positions that they haven't been in before, and essentially, you know, trying to figure out who's going to be your prominent ball handlers, who is going to fill the void of making sure the basketball moves around and is distributed, and you get assists out there. Now fans, obviously you'll turn to, the fact that, well, it needs to be collective. And Quin Snyder will be the first one to tell you. He's talked about it ad nauseum about how defensively this team needs to um, defend collectively. Now, without Trae, he would say the offense needs to, the ball needs to be distributed collectively as a team. And while that is true, there are going to be guys who stand out and fill the void of Trae in a more prominent way than other players on this team will. And so I found it interesting. Lee Ellis of NBA Australia was asking Quinn about, hey, is this an opportunity for Dyson Daniels, who had a very impactful game against the Orlando Magic, and in fact, Dyson finished 8 of 9 from the field with a 3, 6 rebounds, 6 assists, 2 steals. Dyson Daniels was plus 25 against the Orlando Magic, so clearly doing some things right. But asked about whether he will kind of be looked at as the prominent ball handler, Quinn was very quick to kind of shut that notion down.
yeah, I don't necessarily think that's the case. Like you look early in the game, Nikhil was bringing it a fair amount. I think when you play a team that has Jalen Suggs on it, the way that he pressures the ball, to have multiple handlers makes sense. And, we trust Dyson in those situations.
Yeah, so I found it interesting of essentially Quinn trying to say, hey, like this isn't just going to be Dyson filling in, in that prominent ball handler role, even though that's what he did a lot of against the Magic. That's what he's kind of done quite often through these 3 games. And when Nickeil Alexander-Walker has taken over that role, there's been a lot of turnovers. I mean, 7 turnovers for Nickeil Alexander-Walker against the Magic. It felt like a problem at times, and that doesn't mean that he didn't still have a great offensive game because, Nickeil Alexander-Walker did. He finished with 20 points, 6 of 11 from the field, but those 7 turnovers were certainly a problem and something that you just didn't see Dyson struggle with near to the same level, and so I feel like it's natural to think, okay, well, the progression of where things are headed is that this is a role that that Dyson will take over. But I think Quinn is very quick and smartly so, I would say. Even if fans are thinking of give this to Dyson and stop messing around with Nickeil handling this role if he's going to turn over the ball so much. But I do think to some extent we've seen some outliers from Nickeil, but also too the outliers you saw from Dyson earlier in the season when he wasn't shooting the ball well have now kind of course corrected essentially, and he's coming around and able to put up some good numbers. I mean, literally missing one shot against the Orlando Magic on Tuesday night. Um, so you had the good game against the Pacers, but Pacers not the same team that they were obviously in the NBA Finals. No Tyrese Halliburton. And in the game that the Hawks played against the Pacers, they were missing a host, a host of guys who were not available in this one because of injury. And so, kind of difficult to go through and say, okay, well, that's the on par for the same type of team that they would then go see against the Cavaliers, who were a healthier team but still didn't have Darius Garland in that one. But I mean, when you still are playing with Donovan Mitchell, DeAndre Hunter, Evan Mobley, like those are still big impactful players. And so a little bit different when they faced Cleveland, and obviously how Cleveland has set up their offense and has a lot of shooters. Like all of those things are very different. So while it's good to feel good about a win against the Pacers, especially in the dominant way that the Hawks played, it can be slightly frustrating to see how they performed against the Cavs. But then popping up against the Magic, I think this is a team that has seen a lot of equal play and a lot of physical play between these two teams, as clear what was shown on Tuesday night when you literally have Desmond Bane going and pulling on the arm of Onyeka Okongwu as he goes up in transition, and then as he's falling, grabs the ball and just spikes it on double O, and you had Mo Gay was stepping up ready to fight. Ultimately, Desmond Bane gets ejected, and then after the game, just hilariously says, "Oh man, I don't understand. I just thought it was like a regular foul. Like I just went up to block the shot. I couldn't believe that I got ejected." And yet, the video of Desmond Bane clearly pulling on Onyeka's arm down to the ground was everywhere. And I was one to take to social media and be like, "We caught you in 4K, man." Just wild. But because these matchups have been so physical, I think it plays to the Hawks' strength, quite honestly, facing a team like the Magic. And then clearly, when you go and face a team like the Cavs earlier in the season, when they faced, the Oklahoma City Thunder, those are the teams that are set up that I believe in a more new era of basketball way that can provide some difficulties for the Hawks, quite honestly, something that they'll have to overcome. Last thing I wanted to get to on the podcast was I guess last of the like things that have already happened, because we'll take a look at the upcoming schedule for the Hawks. There was a weird situation that happened late in the fourth quarter, or just in the fourth quarter in general for the Hawks against the Magic, where Zaccharie Risacher had a really, really impressive night. And in fact, he led the team at 21 points, was 7 of 14 from the field, 3 of 8 from 3-point, did not have a turnover, and had a steal. So overall performance, I think things have been very up and down for Zach this season, but specifically in this game against the Orlando Magic, I thought you saw that Zaccharie Risacher had a very impressive game. However, with 7 minutes to play in the fourth quarter and the Magic starting to go on a bit of a run, you saw Quin Snyder pull out Zach and put in Luke Kennard. Very understandable, veteran. A lot of different reasons, giving a guy a blow for one, just plenty of reasons to have Zach come out of the game that are perfectly understandable. Wanting a guy who is a ball handler versus, Zach, who is predominantly off ball, all of those sorts of things. Makes a lot of sense. However, the Magic started to go on a bit of a run. And with, I think it was like 3.5 minutes to play, that Quin took a timeout and opted for Vit Krejci to enter the game instead of Zach. And now Vit's been a guy playing pretty low minutes And when he has played more minutes, which, like a game against Cleveland, I think maybe didn't show his best ability. And so far this season, I think just overall for Veet, it's been a bit of a roller coaster of just what type of performance, and that's overall the season, and within games it seems to be a bit of a roller coaster, and you don't exactly know what you're going to get from Veet. And so it was interesting to see, the Hawks are going to close with Veet Krejci, who I can't remember how many minutes he had played up until that point, but I know like it couldn't have been many because he finished with 11. And so yeah, so we're talking somewhere in the 7-minute range, that Veet had played. Meanwhile, Zaccharie Risacher had played 25 minutes, and so I think there was a general question amongst fans, amongst media, of, hey, I wonder why like Zach hasn't been relied on to close out games. There was some conversation that had come up in a previous pregame setting where Quin Snyder had thrown out the fact that maybe Zach is dealing with a minutes restriction is the reason why he has kind of been held, because he had that ankle injury a little while back, and so maybe the Hawks are just being a bit careful with him. Um, in this instance, it was interesting just because I thought we were enough removed from that situation. And when Lauren Williams of the AJC asked Quin Snyder, hey, is that on a minutes restriction? You could tell that Quin, A, didn't like the question, and felt he actually asked, like, what question are you looking for? But I think, from a journalism perspective, you just want the question answered. Hey, is Zach on a minutes restriction? Quinn opted to decide and say that's something for the health and performance staff. We're not going to get into that. Okay, all well and fine. You don't like being asked in that sort of way. So I decided to follow up Lauren's question and just say, because I would love to learn more about, the decision making process that Quin Snyder has, and just understand, hey, if there is, I'm not the most intelligent when it comes to the game of basketball. I am constantly learning. I just like to ask the questions that help people, including myself, learn more. And so the thought was, why did you consider? My question to Quinn was, did you consider playing Zach more late in that fourth, or was that just an option that you didn't want to turn to for whatever reason? And maybe you could go into the fact that Veet is more of a ball handler than Zach. That maybe you just wanted more of a veteran out there as the Magic were going on a bit of a run, and you wanted to get some stops. Maybe you saw Veet's defense as more sound in the moment than Zach's. Whatever reason might be the case, I thought it was a legitimate thing to ask about. It was odd though how Quinn decided to answer this question and found a lot of confusion. It seemed to be.
Well, Zach played 25 minutes and had a really good game. If you look through our rotation, he's going to play 25, he's going to play 30. Felt like Veet was playing really well. If you look at the stat sheet, everybody's, plus. So different combinations. I think we always try to be careful not to fixate on one player. And in this case, that means Zach had a really good game, particularly finishing transition. Guys were finding him from three, and it felt good to see him kind of get untracked again.
Yeah, so the part that Quinn says about not fixating on players, I think it's been a point of emphasis with Quinn to not focus on Zaccharie Risacher. And in fact, when Zach was a rookie, questions would get asked about Zach, and it was almost a confusion of like, man, why are we talking so much about Zach? And you kind of want to say, hey, Quinn, he's the number one overall pick from a year ago. Like, that's what happens with number one overall picks. They get a lot of attention. If you were to go look at the discussion around the Dallas Mavericks this season, it's going to be Cooper Flagg. And in fact, everyone who is doing a podcast, a radio show, any sort of content about the Dallas Mavericks is going to be talking about Cooper Flagg, and rightfully so. He is the number one overall pick. You're going to talk about him when he's playing well. You're going to talk about him when he's not playing well. All of these sorts of things, because that is what the attention that happens naturally when you're discussing the number one overall pick. Now, in this instance of me asking the question about Zach playing late in the game, hearing, well, some games he's going to play 25 minutes, sometimes he's going to play 30, was my exact thought of, why was this a game that he played 25 and not 30? Because it was pretty obvious to see on the sidelines that Zach was in his warm-up shirt. There was never a moment in which Quin was really even considering, through a couple of timeouts that he had the opportunity to put Zach in, of getting him in the game. And so with that, it was just, one of those, would love to better understand for all of those reasons, I just kind of presented to you. Now, he does mention the fact that Veet was playing well. Was he playing, better than Zach? I wouldn't necessarily say that he was, but in a different way that was more beneficial in the moment. Maybe that was the case. Maybe that is how Quin saw it, and it would have been helpful if that was more of the conversation, rather than Quin, in fact, at one point saying, I don't understand the question. And I didn't think it was much of a difficult question to ask. It was just why did you not go back to Zach late in the fourth quarter, and instead went to Luke Kennard and Veet Krejci? There can be explanations for that answer that aren't necessarily complicated, and I think would appease a lot of people. It just seemed like a bit confrontational to get to that point, and I found it a bit odd. It continued as well with Quin Snyder's answer, as he got into essentially this overarching theme of, I'm not going to explain to you guys every decision that I make, when it comes to rotations.
There's going to be times when we have Luke in the game for his ball handling. There's going to be times when we have Mo in the game for his defense. And it's one of those situations where if we sit here and start to critique rotations and minutes, I could go into a little diatribe about why I played everybody, why I did, and why we substituted when we did. We took Kristaps out and played through O because he was playing well. We played a matchup game. So I'm not going to do that. And I'm not.
Yeah, I think for Quin, it was this idea of questioning this one aspect of the game somehow meant that we were going to question every aspect of every decision that he makes. And to some extent, like, that is the game of basketball. That is what happens with a head coach, is that people question the decisions that he makes, especially when they don't work out. Now, in this case, I found it a bit odd, just because I was just looking for better clarification of a specific moment. But overall, you're dealing with a win. Like, you're dealing with a really positive 127-112 win for the Hawks over the Magic. And instead of, discussing the bright spots of how Dyson played and how great that Zach was, just wanting some clarification, it felt like it was a bit contentious. And in fact, Quin at one point says, I'm not being defensive, and it felt as though that was the case in regards to this. And when it could be that, hey, 25 minutes is the cap right now for Zach. And maybe that is something that Quin doesn't want to speak on for, competitive advantage. For all of those reasons, it felt like there was a way to go about answering the question without being as snarky, maybe, I guess, is what I felt like I got in response to Quin. But just, one of those little odd things that will just completely move on, and there'll be a lot more basketball to discuss in the coming days, and a lot more specific things to get into with Quin that I'm sure he'll be happy to talk about in the future. Coming up on the Hawks schedule on Friday, you've got another home game against the Toronto Raptors. Of course, this was the team that on opening night, just absolutely punched you in the face. 86 points in the paint. It hadn't happened at least since the year 2000 for the Atlanta Hawks. Like, so many things went wrong for the Hawks against the Raptors. That was bizarre in that opening night game. So you get a second opportunity of you don't have Trae Young, which is unfortunate, but getting that rematch of sorts is going to be interesting to see how they handle that the second time around, knowing how Toronto likes to play. You also get the Los Angeles Lakers. That normally, a big game for the Hawks taking on the Lakers. Everybody wants to come in and see LeBron James, but clearly, um, it's very much, I think, up in the air as to whether or not LeBron is going to be available. It is my understanding that it is mid-November that LeBron James will be available. So for fans who are coming out to State Farm Arena to see the Hawks take on the Lakers, it'll be Luka Doncic that is be the main star that people are going to be interested in. And then kind of just a bit of a few games following this is a West Coast road trip that the Hawks will go on following the game against the Lakers. You've got the Clippers, the Kings, the Jazz, the Suns, and then you come back home ultimately. So that 4-game West Coast road trip is going to be another test for this Hawks team. But getting into that, finishing up this latest homestand, this is a really important time for the Hawks, who are getting practice time, but also getting rest time in between facing the Magic and facing the Toronto Raptors. And it'll be interesting to see, how the Hawks handle this stretch of time and whether the winning continues. And of course, that means the conversation about Trae Young's future will continue to go, whether it's warranted or not. But so will if things go the opposite direction and this team starts to suddenly, lose games, then I think there will be, more of a microscope put on Quin Snyder, more of questions brought in of any additions that can be made to this team. Just so much can happen in a short amount of time, and I think this next week is going to be an interesting span of that time to see what ultimately happens with the Hawks. That'll do it for this episode of Atlanta Basketball with Caleb Johnson. Give me a follow on social media at ATL Johnson 18, the radio station at 929 The Game. Go wherever you listen to podcasts and watch this on YouTube and subscribe to it. Give us a like, comment, anything of that sort of thing to know what you think, know what you like, what you want to hear more of. All of those, I am always up for those sorts of things. Until next time, this has been Atlanta Basketball with Caleb Johnson. Y'all have a good one.